Welcome to Uncommons Weekly, a roundup of what's happening on Parliament Hill. Well, Parliament wrapped up the session this week, and we passed the budget finally before we rose. That budget prioritizes housing, defense spending, a new disability benefit, the beginnings of pharmacare with diabetes medication and birth control covered, a national school food program, and much more. Just to zero in on housing for a second, though, because Conservatives talk a big game on housing, build the homes. And fairly, Poilievre has rightly railed against gatekeepers, slow approval times, and restrictive zoning. First, though, worth noting that these are municipal and provincial gatekeepers, and in many cases, Conservatives, like this guy, who only wants to build homes if they are on the Greenbelt. But for all of the talk, put the Liberals' budget, their housing plan, against Poilievre's housing plan, and it's actually not even close, and we'll be doing a full rundown on that in the coming weeks. Now, everything depends on implementation, including on housing, including on the recent Canadian dental care program. And you may have seen headlines about a seeming public fight as between the Minister of Health and dental care associations, but it is actually rolling out smoothly. We've got a third of dental care providers that are already in the program, and it's just in its infancy, and we only hear good things from constituents. It is rolling out smoothly, just like electoral reform. Now, that's a pain point, and I am kidding, but we are talking about some kind of reform in the House, the Electoral Participation Act, which has finally been kicked to committee. More interesting, to me at least, Elizabeth May has tabled a bill to create space for a national referendum on electoral reform. I like the idea, and as I told Dr. Philpott on the most recent Uncommons podcast, electoral reform is still a sore spot and easily the worst moment for me as an MP. A recent commitment that the government did finally follow through on this week was to list the IRGC as a terrorist entity. We voted on that a while back in Parliament, and it is a political statement to be sure. Experts rightly note that enforcement matters most. We need to also ensure effective enforcement is central to our foreign interference response. I'm not going to reiterate what I said last week, but I will add that we need more transparency where allegations are serious and the evidence is credible. And Poilievre should read the damn report. I am trying to imagine if I had won the Ontario Liberal leadership and then our spy agency told me a foreign power interfered in that race, and then I told them I didn't want to know more because of partisan political gain. Foreign interference, that debate isn't going away, nor is the debate around capital gains. In an op-ed last week, Freeland argued for tax fairness. She wrote that because of how investment gains are taxed, well-off Canadians can wind up paying a lower overall tax rate than a nurse or a carpenter. That is obviously unfair. Poilievre responded with a 16-minute, somewhat disjointed video slamming the changes, framing it as both an attack on productivity and unfair to seniors who just want to pass property to their family. On the first point, here's what the IMF had to say. The increase in the capital gains inclusion rate is likely to have no significant impact on investment or productivity growth. Small business owners, by the way, if they profit less than $6 million on the sale of their business, they're actually going to see a tax cut because of these changes.
And I said, why should I pay capital gain? You know, I'm not selling it to them. I'm gifting it to them.
On the second point, passing property to a kid or grandkid, that video, it's a case that isn't impacted by these tax changes at all, just by the previous capital gains taxation system, which I guess he might just entirely oppose, axe all tax. I'm going to reiterate that it is very easy to avoid the new taxes on the transfer of an asset to your kid or grandkid by structuring the sale over many years. That's the capital gains reserve. Now, in one part of Poilievre's video, he tells the story of how capital and labor go hand in hand. Politically, this frame allows him to court both the bosses and the workers, even if he truly stands with the boss against the worker. And yes, labor and capital are both necessary for productivity, but they very obviously are at odds politically in a number of ways. And maybe let's not trust the guy who says more boots, less suits, while he is wearing a suit with a history of anti-union rhetoric in that suit pocket. So, yes, our anti-scab legislation received royal assent this week, you should know that, and it passed Parliament with unanimous support. That is a good thing. But let's not forget that the freedom-loving Conservative leader, when he first talked about freedom so many years ago, it was freedom to work, a euphemism for union busting. And I don't want to discount freedom here. It's Pride Month. Everyone should be free to be who they are and to love who they love. If you aren't hurting anyone, government should leave you alone. You don't have to understand it. Your religion doesn't need to agree with it. We live in a pluralistic society, and we should celebrate and defend that fundamental freedom of being true to ourselves without government interference. June isn't only Pride Month, it's also National Indigenous History Month, and today in particular is Indigenous Peoples Day. There are many people worth recognizing, but I want to take a moment to recognize Lindsay Kretschmer, a constituent, but more than that, the executive director of TASK, a coalition of now 24 Indigenous service organizations here in Toronto. Thanks to her work and about $2 million in federal support, TASK will soon have a permanent home here in the city. A shout out also to Indigenous Senator Marty Klein, who has picked up Murray Sinclair's efforts to advance the Jane Goodall Act, Government Bill S-15, which has been improved at the Senate committee recently, and worked to protect animals in captivity. So happy Pride, happy Indigenous Peoples Day, and please go vote in the by-election in Toronto St. Paul's on Monday. I will have more to say on that next week. I mean, by the time we comment next week, we'll know the results. We'll also know the results of the Stanley Cup, and I hope the Oilers will have come back against the odds in dramatic fashion. The perpetual conservative outrage machine bizarrely claimed that CBC should be carrying the games. CBC does carry the games on TV, as I understand it, although I would have to go to my grandmom's to watch it. But pick a damn lane. Do you want to kill the CBC, or do you want it to compete with private sector broadcasting on content that is commercially viable? Now, I was going to leave you with the clip of the conservative heritage critic staring into the abyss when asked about cutting Radio-Canada. But instead, I want to leave you with this. Here's a chart of federal spending on Indigenous priorities, which has almost tripled, actually, from $11 billion in 2015 to $32 billion as of the recent budget. And if the Conservatives are going to relentlessly take down the Prime Minister with his quotes about the budget balancing itself, it is fair game to highlight this Poilievre classic during a time when Harper apologized and offered compensation for residential schools.
Now, along with this apology comes another $4 billion in compensation for those who partook in the residential schools over those years. Now, some of us are starting to ask it, are we really getting value for all of this money? And is more money really going to solve the problem? My view is that we need to engender the values of hard work and independence and self-reliance. That's the solution in the long run. More money will not solve it.